How many poets is it? Yeah. I know about 8 versions of that. I better not bring them up. We're recognizing famous and infamous poets in the audience, and there are a lot of unrecognized great ones here. But I want to recognize my friend Richard Jackson from Chattanooga and his wife Sarah. Richard brought a whole gang of, we have, 150 people here. About 120 of them came down from Chattanooga. And I want to thank them for that long ride and how sad they'll be when they have to drive back tonight. It's a long ride back to Chattanooga. Chattanooga. Is there a choo-choo in Chattanooga? There really is? Pardon me, boy. Is that the Chattanooga choo-choo? Track 29. Oh, you can give me a shine. I can afford to board the Chattanooga choo-choo. I've got my fare and just a trifle to spare. Well, I wasn't paid $40,000 to come down here and sing songs from the 1940s. Now, that's really what I want to do. You leave the Pennsylvania station about 3:45. You read a magazine and then you're in Baltimore. Dinner on a diner, nothing could be finer than to have your ham and eggs in Carolina. When you hear the whistle blowing 8 to the bar, then you know the Tennessee is not very far. Shovel all the calling, gotta keep it rolling. Chattanooga, there we are. There's gonna be a certain party at the station, satin and lace, and so on and so on. Now, poets, they like to talk about other poets. I want to think tonight about a dear friend of ours who died a few years ago, Larry Levis, and read a little poem for him called Eggshell. And I wrote this a day after he died. He was born in 1946 and died betimes in 1996. It's about a robin's eggshell, blue, green, depending how long gone it is and such. The color of life is an almost pale white robin's green that once was bluer when it was in the nest, before the jay deranged the straw and warm flesh was in the shell. I found it while doing my 45-minute walk between 2 doors beside some bushes and flowers. I put it in one of my pockets, keeping some space around it to protect the pale green. An idiot carrying a dead child inside him, something that might have broken out anyway, a blue afterbirth shoved out of the nest. I laid my dead like eggs on the table, 12 tombstones to a box. I buried dread that way, my telephone calls and letters. And on the way I walked into a side yard and straightened a brick, for it was May, and chased a garter snake into his rain spout. And since it was morning and it was hot already, I put the eggshell under a leather chair and thought of our trip to New Orleans and used the end of a broom to prop up a rose bush, the way we do, sweet Larry. 12 eggs to a box is, we're so used to that. Yet, buy me a dozen eggs. Why a dozen? Why aren't there 10? Where's water here? Where the hell's the water? Thanks, darling. Why aren't there 10 eggs to a box? Or I actually saw some experimental, versions of this, which really disappoint me because I'm a traditionalist, I'm a conservative. And I saw in a supermarket the other day 8 eggs. I said, what's going on? 8 eggs to a box. I mean, I know that eggs aren't good for you and such. Although eggs are making a comeback. Eggs are making a comeback, so don't feel guilty when you eat an egg. Don't eat egg beaters, for God's sake. Eat it or don't eat it. Egg beaters. Here's a poem called Swan Legs. Swan Lake, you know Swan Lake, that's Christmas time, Swan Lake. I always wanted to write a poem about Swan Lake, and they always came out corny. And one day I was sitting in the doctor's office waiting to die, handling my heart beating. They always do your blood pressure, you're dying, 400 above 200, Well, that's a little normal. White coat, blood pressure, And I'm reading this article about Mao Zedong, the old premier, the horrible monster from China. We had our monsters. I'm not going to get into it. No politics tonight. And the article was about how he went to the Soviet Union twice, and the second time he was a guest of Khrushchev, premier of Russia. And he told him to see Swan. What do you do with a guy from China comes there? You take him to see Swan Lake. I mean, Mao Zedong, he couldn't understand it. So here's a poem about that. It's called Swan Legs. Because, during the revolutionary period, we ate swans. People used to eat swan. Let me assure you that they're delicious. And Tom tells me we're going out later to eat some swan. I mean, goose we eat, duck we eat, chicken. Why not swan? That's true, sparrow. Just for a second, when Mao stood up and walked out of the theater in Leningrad, the swan stopped dancing, and Khrushchev just shrugged his shoulders and lowered his eyes. Mao's hatred of tutus prevailed, as his hatred of Russian food and his hatred of clean napkins. Nixon and Kissinger sat for the swan in Washington. They passed notes between them, and when they were finished reading, they tore them in tiny pieces. The swan believed in suffering, so she floated across the stage. Well, sort of floated, and so it goes. The pricks down there in their seats, they couldn't care less. They feasted on swan legs. They took care of themselves. Yet why should I pick on them? There is enough feasting even without them. I usually know pricks. The swan is lucky for such a bird to do what she does to music, to do it to song, her head in the air, so misunderstood and hated, so wrongly loved. First her dark beak swaying, and that is a violin. Then her leaping, and that is the harp, or the comb. Look at me forgetting the comb and the sweet potato. When I was a swan myself, and I almost floated. The one I remember, she sang and trilled a little. That was a swan with a voice. The thigh is wider than a chicken's. The flesh is dark and stringy. It was vinegar they forced down the throat, plain distilled white vinegar, to soften the wild flesh and kill the suffering. Well, let me get a light poem. It's called Oscar. It's about a squirrel. I wrote this poem, and I never pointed out that it was a stuffed squirrel. And it sounds funny if you don't know it's a stuffed squirrel. I published it, somewhere, and I lost it, and it's called Oscar. My mother never wanted me to have pets. So I had we had a canary once. His name was, I'm ashamed to tell you, but his name was Dickie. Dickie. The squirrel was made for me, and not me for the squirrel. That's a paraphrase of the New Testament. Jesus says, Sabbath was made for me, and not made for, Sabbath was made for you, I think he says, or you are not made for something like that. But I'm not a Presbyterian, what would I know? The squirrel was made for me and not me for the squirrel, and it is running up and down that causes the turmoil while I am sitting with my own acorn in my mouth, and unlike him, I'm ashamed of burying my money. So I did it for my children, and in the long cold night we will pass sweet figs between us and chunks of chicken cooked in raisin juice and carrots almost white from so much sugar. He keeps talking about the same tree over and over. He's relentless, and dark whiffs of joy called knowledge or memory keep bringing him back, although only a dozen soft balls are still hanging from one tree, and truly nothing but a dried up leaf from the other. I warn him against the overbite and the new dentist filling him with gold, considering the bankers as thieves, grave robbers, and protocol keepers, but he just stalks and flounces, and he just croons as if he were made of water, or as if he just lived for the wheel and its aftermath. I think we may be celebrating in different ways and even have a different view of the slow-moving sun itself. But nonetheless, I adjust his tail and rub his stomach and kiss him the way I did when he lived on that rough little branch, and ask his forgiveness for selling him for $1. This book is, I'm just reading from several sources here. I'm just going to go very quickly. Tempus fugit, which means time waits for no man. I'm not going to sing that. Time waits for no one. It passes you by. Yeah. And these are called American, this is called American Sonnets. All this is for sale very cheap. It's much cheaper than her books. Now you buy them both, for God's sake. And these are sonnets. A lot of people who are traditionalists have attacked me because my sonnets are not 14 lines, but they do have those aspects of the sonnets which count. That is, they are intellectual, mysterious, autobiographical. One requires the next one, and they have a break in the middle called Various Things by various critics. A turn is the word. And they're evasive. I'll read 3 or 4 of these. They all take place in the winter, and they take place in western Pennsylvania, where I come from, which is the other end of Appalachia. This one's called Winter Thirst. It's the first one. I grew up with bituminous in my mouth and sulfur smelling like rotten eggs, and I first started to cough because my lungs were like cardboard. And what we called snow was gray with black flecks that were like glue when it came to snowballs and made them hard and crusty, though we still ate the snow anyhow. And as for filth, well, start with smoke. I carried it with me, I know everywhere, and someone sitting beside me in New York or Paris would know where I came from. We would go in for dinner, red meatloaf or brown choucroute, and he would guess my hill. And we would talk about soot, and what a dirty neck was like, and how the white collar made a fine line. And I told him how we pulled heavy wagons and loaded boxcars every day from 5 to 1 a.m., and how good it was walking empty-handed to the number 69 streetcar, and how I dreamed of my bath, and how the water was black and soapy then, and what the void was like, and how a candle instructed me. My next book, it's coming out next spring. It's called Everything is Burning, and I discovered that burning is a kind of a theme in my poetry. I discovered at this late age. I have several poems in here about burning. I'm going to read one. It's called Burning. When you listen to a poem, those of you who are not very experienced at that, just listen to the words, let it fall upon you. It's not like information about how to get to Chicago or something like that. It's how to get away from Chicago. Where's the mind that asked whether the drugstore that stood at the crest of a hill and had a beacon as its emblem, and I ate fruit salad sundaes there and grilled cheese sandwiches, was or wasn't a tower? In the sense that there were porches, windows, and staircases, in the sense that there were mirrors and shining lamps and 1 or 2 banners, and what was a tower doing there with me walking to the library and post office and only a Chinese restaurant next door? And where's the mind that abided the large plaza outside the drugstore and made its own canopies and beautiful flying objects? And where did the tower come from in the dream of emptiness that has abided for more than 50 years? and the heart which burned, such was burning, and such was the tower, it also burned. Only in that case, it wasn't attached to anything. It burned of its own volition, and mountains in Pennsylvania still burn, alas. They have an abode, and empty bottles explode, and paper flutes burn, and birdsong. There is a mountain in central Pennsylvania. It's been burning for 40 years. They can't put it out. And I think they'll bomb it eventually. They're planning a hydrogen bomb. They say they'll put out the fire. Well, it's a perfectly reasonable response to a mountain burning. You drop a hydrogen bomb on it. Let me read a poem here called Roses. Now, roses, you know, there's a tradition to name roses after famous people or opera singers or beautiful ladies or criminals. Al Capone, there's a rose called Al Capone. And some of these I made up and some are true, and I forgot. I forgot to take good notes. It celebrates to the end some Haitians that I knew, and there's a large Haitian community in Miami, and there's another large Haitian community in the Upper West Side in New York, and a lot of Haitians are cab drivers in Miami. And when you speak French to them, they are so happy, they just turn around, oh, mais vous parlez français? And I no, keep going, give it to me. There was a rose called Guy de Maupassant, a carmine pink that smelled like a Granny Smith. And there was another from the 17th century that wept too much and wilted when you looked. And one that caused tuberculosis. Doctors dug them up. They wore white masks and posted warnings in the windows. One wet day it started to hail. Pellets the size of snowballs fell on the roses. It's hard for me to look at a Duchess of Windsor. It was worn by Franco and Mussolini. It stabbed Jews. Yesterday, I bought 6 roses from a Haitian on Lower Broadway. He wrapped them in blue tissue paper. It was starting to snow, and both of us had on the wrong shoes. There was wind, he said, not snow that ruined roses, and all you had to do was hold them against your chest. He had a ring on his pinky the size of a grape, and half his teeth were gone. So I loved him and spoke to him in false Creole, for which he hugged me and enveloped me in his camel hair coat with most of the buttons missing. And we were brothers for life. We swore it in French. This is that new little book. It's a weird little book. The title is taken from one of the poems. It's called Mop God, After All. There's some wonderful drawings here by an incredible painter named Sheba Sharrow. And they're epigrams, I guess you'd call them, or they're little apophthegms, or they are Zen sayings. And there's no tradition. They come out of nowhere. I wrote them all in 2 weeks in Puerto Rico once. I stole most of them from my lady friend, my love, Anne-Marie McCary, and that's her name. And she was furious at me for stealing whatever she said. She stopped talking. She hasn't talked for 2 years. And each of these epigrams is 14 syllables long, 2 lines, so 7, 7. And 14 syllables goes very quick. I just said 47 syllables. I'll read about 8 or 10 of them so you get an idea. So you should get a taste of things before you really dip into them, Premarital reading. Well, you can be married to a book. I don't know what the color of the iris first was. Blue? For my immortality, I wear only purple socks. A beaver eating loosestrife. None of us could believe it. Reading Gombrowicz in Puerto Rico, speaking Polish. Where did you stay last night? There was a white swan in my bed. Numero Uno, the name of our hotel in San Juan. Just like flies all over the place. They're good workers, though. These are words I hear, I hear everything. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Same bullshit. The poem about me is the best poem you ever wrote. How his love scolded him and his psychiatrist pitched in. The shit out of luck blues, weary blues, potato skin blues. Judy was a friend of mine. She could do it any time. I judge everyone by the length of her fingers. Sorry. And that's what they're like. And here's the monoplane. You've been on the shore where you see monoplanes come by, Atlantic City. The monoplane is God soothing us for half a minute. The trailer, that's the announcement behind it, the advertisement. The trailer, more banking in less time. I didn't see it. Más banco en menos tiempo, the soothing sign says. It's not God after all, it's a Chase Manhattan back. I don't mind the nudists, I just can't stand the vitamins. And so on. You're not the only pineapple on the pineapple tree. Here's one I got right out of Aunt Marie's mouth. She's driving. She's terrified when she drives to New York City. Just terrified. If someone yelled bingo, you'd walk a lot faster than that. Anne Marie has hidden the Spanish dictionary. Keep your hands to yourself. Where do you think we are, in bed? Saddest underpants I ever saw, yellow polka dots. Honor your poet, one of Moses's shattered commandments. And I'll end up with one or two. Melancholy, you prude, I devoted my life to you. And when we were Leviticus, I am with you all the way, no menage. We had knives in our boots, luckies and camels in our mouths. It ends up with, I'm going to go cut my own throat right after breakfast. Let me read some recent poems. A lot of these have been published in magazines, and we did mention a magazine. We did mention a gentleman earlier who was a state poet of Georgia, and he is the editor of an extraordinary magazine that you have in this state called 5 Points, which I want to recommend to you only because I periodically publish it. No, seriously, it's a beautiful magazine. I mean, you should be extremely proud of it. Let me read 5 or 6 poems here, and then we'll all go out and drink till dawn. Dawn will be here in an hour or so. Just a way of looking at things. Hemingway's house. I don't want to go to Hemingway's house. Let him come to mine. Walk in and we'll do the killers at my kitchen table. He with his back to the Japanese maple, me with my back to the Maytag, ginger ale for one, white rum the other, the dragon and the mayfly, death and the knowledge of death, Monk and Bartok, all the same to me. Here's one called Mars. In 1938, when I was still alive, when I was alive, they had this guy named Orson Welles, big fat guy. He was fat later on, and he had this thing called the War of the Worlds, a visit from a radio show. It made him famous. He was in his mid-20s, and my father was a salesman, and salesmen believe everything that they sell. And I came home from the movies. I was 12 years old. And he was packing. We were going to go to a cave. I swear to God. Orson Welles. It's called Mars. What do you say about Orson Welles? His folly, his belly full of sheepskin, liquid of ale. What do you say about the cave and the bluff, my father? Oh, were packing us up one night at the end of the 30s. He knew was a child. Dark-skinned Jewish bastard. He had smoked there. Toby's, and lukewarm RC Cola, child, roasted potatoes. And I came home from the movie at 10 o'clock and he was packing and for they was crazy for caves and them Martians and them Martians. And I saw Orson in 1950 in Paris, He was directing a play and he was fat. he bade us welcome. And how did we know? And was it Macbeth? Child, child in 1950, for I love touch of evil best. And worst, worst, Citizen Kane of California, Hearst, Hearst. Now, the golden rule, you should not do to others what you don't want them to do to yourself, or you should do to others what they don't do to you. I can't remember, but there was a famous rabbi who recited the golden rule while standing on one leg. It's famous Talmudic lore. This is called golden rule. It's for my blue jay. I have a blue jay in my backyard. I might have two blue jays for all I know. All she wants is for you to stay away from her egg. And all she wants is for you to shut up when it comes to the three things she hates the most: justice, mercy, humility. She detests Jesus, and she can define what he is and was and wants to be while flying unbearably low by the one word, squawk. And that is why I pulled my straw hat down over my bald head, and that is why my orange cat almost died with fear, and why she won the argument with her big black shadow while resting only on one leg. When I was first started to teach English in Philadelphia, we used to call it Filthydelphia, Temple University there, I was 30 years old. I used to be 30 years old. And I was even younger than that once. And, I fell in love with Thoreau, like all freshman years. I like to teach Thoreau. How he went and lived on a lake underwater. He held his breath for a couple of years. He taught simplicity. And then I finally got married, had children, had bills, had Visa cards, was in debt. Debito ergo sum, the American motto, debito ergo sum, I owe, therefore I exist. And I'm driving down the road one day to my house. It was on a river in Pennsylvania, and Pocono, people from Poconos were coming down to Philadelphia Sunday night in the summer, caught in traffic, and this happened. And it's called Lilies. And it's New Testament. It takes its title from the saying, the lilies of the field, they neither spin, etc. In other words, don't save for your old age and such. Those lilies of the field. One Sunday night I got caught in Pocono traffic and sat there for 20 minutes, during the which in front a madman saw me in his mirror and leaped out of his car and running screamed, "Dr. Stern, I followed your advice. I gave up everything. Thoreau was right, simplicity. I was your student." To which I stared at him. The cars were starting up again, but I no longer believed and had to leave him stranded. "I love you," I shouted. "Read something else." I would have pulled off the side of the road, but there was no shoulder there, and so I lost him, whatever his name was. I made a sharp left turn, and that was that. But what I owe him in his undershirt, how long his beard was then, his eyes were blue, his tires were bald, what Christ owes me. Three more, maybe. Here's one called Shouldering. You've heard of Monk, Thelonious Monk, I know, and you've heard of Sarah Vaughan. We were surrounded by buttercup and phlox, so you know what the month was. One of us had Sarah Vaughan in her ear, one of us Monk. Who put a table there, we didn't know, but we were more or less grateful. There wasn't even chained to anything, and the eggs we ate were perfect. I cracked them on my head, as I always do, and shattered them with my fist. The grape tomatoes, which only cost $1 a pint, were almost acid-free. The tire was growing softer, but I was a veteran of real tires and bumper jacks. I even go back to steaming radiators. "I can tell you things," I said to Monk. "I walked 2 miles once with a half-gallon of gas leaking out of an orange juice carton." "In my solitude," he said. "September song," said she. And I will read 2 more poems. One called Bolero. You know Bolero? And then I'll read a poem that's a little different than the others called She Was a Dove, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. Bolero. So one day I have my son's radio. I have a lot of radios in my house. I have a big house, room after room full of books and papers and coffee cups, and I have an old radio that's still there that my son had when he was in junior high school. So one day when the azalea bush was firing away and the Japanese maple was roaring, I came into the kitchen full of daylight and turned on my son's Sony sliding over the lacquered floor in my stocking feet, for it was time to rattle the canisters and see what sugar and barley have come to and how bolero sounds after all these years, and if I'm loyal still, and when did I have a waist that thin, and if my style was too nostalgic, and where were you when I was burning alive, Nightingale? She was a dove. Now this is a rhymed poem. The way we all wrote before we started to write free verse, and I went back to rhymed poems. I've written one of them. But it's a kind of 17th century or 1950s poem on one level. It's in quatrains. It's called She Was a Dove. And I'll end with this. And don't forget, don't go because Tom wants to make an announcement and ask you to buy some Christmas trees and stuff. Red are her eyes, for she was a dove once, and green was her neck, and blue and gray her throat. Croon was her cry, and noisy flutter her wing once, going for water or reaching up for another note. And yellow her bill, though white some, and red her feet, though not to match her eyes, for they were more suave, those feet. And he who bore down above her, his feathers dropped around her like chaff from wheat. And black was her mood. Consider a dove that black, as if some avian fury had overcome her and overtaken my own, lackadaisical state. For she was the one I loved, and I abused her. Blue we lived in, blue was our country seat, and wrote our letters out on battered plates, and fought injustice, and once or twice French kissed there, and took each other out on desperate dates. And it was a question always, should we soar, like eagles, you know, or should we land and stay? The battle I fought for 60 years or more and still go over every day. And there was a spot of orange above the bone that bore a wing, though I could never explain how that was what I lived and died for, or that it blossomed in the brain. Thank you. Thank you so much.